It's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to this day of this important symposium on love and war, 1914 to 2024. My name is Richard English. I'm director of, to give it its full title, the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. The Mitchell Institute is absolutely honoured and delighted to be involved in co-supporting this important symposium. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute, a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a great event. I know it started very well last night with the opening lecture, and today's programme and the work throughout the symposium is extraordinary. Some very brief words from me only, and then I'll hand over to the people who are far more important than me in running it and in speaking. The Mitchell Institute tries to focus on supporting innovative, exciting, pioneering research, and there's no doubt that this symposium is hugely significant in terms of that. The quality of the speakers, the originality of the approach and engagement is striking, and so we're absolutely delighted to be supporting exciting research. We also try to do things which are genuinely interdisciplinary, and we're trying to expand the range of the disciplines which are involved, and I think again this symposium shows the quality of what can be done there, and I think that's incredibly significant too. So we're delighted with that, and thank you for that. The third thing about it in terms of the Mitchell Institute's approach is we do like to do things in terms of partnerships. Since I became director in 2021. I was going to say 1821, but 2021. Since I became director, we tried to do things in partnership within and beyond Queen's. And again, this symposium is an exemplary case of how to do that. And I'm very grateful that the Mitchell Institute is able to partner with people within and between Queen's and other institutions in the symposium. So exciting research, interdisciplinary research, extraordinarily wide-ranging subjects of high importance, and all done in partnership. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for everyone's work in making it happen. I'm particularly grateful to Alison and to Ruth for putting together this symposium. So please now, as we begin today's work in the symposium, join me in warmly welcoming Alison Garden and Ruth Duffy.
I'd like to say some thank yous. First of all, to Richard, thank you very much for the introduction, and also to the Mitchell Institute for the support that has made this event possible, including hiring Alan, our technical assistant extraordinaire. Also, I'd like to thank UKRI, so UK Research and Innovation, the School of Arts, English and Languages, the Institute of Irish Studies and the Ulster Museum for all their support of this event. Also, amazing huge thanks to Tom Hume for stepping in at the very last minute on Friday afternoon, I think, and you're going first, so we really appreciate that. And also to Ruth, who also heroically stepped in at the last minute. And before I pass over to Ruth, I'd also like to, make you aware that this is a sensitive topic. We'll be talking about several conflicts that are ongoing. I'd like to ask you to be respectful of everyone's time and to treat the subject with due care and nuance. I'm going to pass over to Ruth.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Richard, for the very lovely welcoming remarks. Alison's just given me the job of talking a little bit about where this idea for love and war came from. So, as some of you might know, that Alison and I work on a project called Acts of Union, Mixed Marriage in Modern Ireland, which is funded by the UKRI, the Future Leaders Fellowship. I'm very lucky to work with Alison on that project, and we are an interdisciplinary team. Alison, literary critic, cultural historian, and myself, I'm what would describe myself as an oral historian. So we work together on a project looking at the experiences of mixed relationships and mixed marriages in Ireland during the 20th century, how these have been represented, but also the real life experiences as well. So obviously Ireland, particularly in the 20th century, history of conflict, division, along ethno-political and religious lines. And for us, the mixed marriages that we come in contact with, a lot of them have been experienced during particularly the conflict here in Northern Ireland in recent years. And we got this idea to talk about how people love across these divides and how the effect of conflict has on people pursuing relationships. And we started to think, well, what's it like for other conflict zones and people's experience of love? And then more widely, what kind of ideas of love, ideas of family love or care or different concepts of love. And we thought perhaps we should bring some people together who could talk a little bit more about that, who have more expertise than we would have on these areas. And so we're very, very happy and to have so many wide variety of speakers from different disciplines who are coming together to talk about so many different conflict zones over the next 2 days. And we're just really excited to hear it.
Yes, thank you very much, Ruth. So part of the aim of the symposium is to illuminate and enrich our understanding of the Irish experience of love and conflict by contextualising it through turning our sights beyond Ireland, which scholars of Ireland aren't always necessarily that good at doing. Ruth and I are very aware of our own disciplinary and geographical limitations, and we wanted to assemble a diverse range of experts to explore how love and war have interacted across a range of other conflicts throughout the long 20th century. We are extremely excited about the knowledge and insight in this room today, and can't wait to learn from you all over the next couple of days. Something that has also struck me during our research into love in Ireland is how restrictive our default understanding of love can be. The romantic elements of love and desire are vital, as we all know, and hugely political, which not always appreciated as such. But I'm also really interested in what else love can do, because it's a hugely powerful emotion, and if we think about it, often responsible for so much conflict. Love of country, religion, people and place have driven so much war. But the inverse is also true. I think so often about Gordon Wilson, who lost his daughter Marie in the 1987 Enniskillen Remembrance Day bombing committed by the Provisional IRA. Holding her father's hand, Marie's last words were, "Daddy, I love you very much." In a subsequent interview, Gordon would later say of those responsible for the atrocity, "But I bear no ill will, I bear no grudge. I will pray for these men tonight and every night." It was also Gordon Wilson who inspired Michael Longley, of whom we've heard a little bit about recently, to write Ceasefire, one of the finest poems about love and war I know. I think it can be really easy to sentimentalise love as a soft emotion, but I hope this symposium will give us the chance to challenge this and to think about love as an active, difficult process that might require an extreme capacity for forgiveness, enormous moral courage, like Gordon Wilson, or immense bravery, like loving a so-called enemy. I want to reiterate how welcome you all are and how much I'm looking forward to the next few days. I know Ruth is too. Thank you all for coming, and I'm really delighted to hand over to Eva Fisherwood-Wallace, who will be chairing our first panel.
Hello. Thank you, Alison. So first we have Dr. Tom Hume of Queen's University Belfast and his paper, Sailors, Soldiers and Queer Life in Belfast During Wartime. Dr. Tom Hume is a reader in modern British history at Queen's University Belfast, where he has taught since 2016. He is currently working on a book titled Belfast Men, An Intimate Queer History of Life Before Liberation, and has written on this topic for Gay Times, Irish Historical Studies and the History of the Family. Working with Leanne McCormick, Maurice Casey and Charlie Lynch, he runs an Arts and Humanities Research Council project titled Queer Northern Ireland, Sexuality Before Liberation. Over the next year, there will be a range of public outputs, from a BBC radio dramatisation of Belfast during the 1930s to a recreation in the Ulster Museum of a gay man's County Down shed, which I think we're all looking forward to seeing. And next we have Dr. Shamragni Banerjee with her paper, Nursing the Lover's Body, or Prescribing the Personal Boundaries of Race. Dr. Shamragni Banerjee is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Northumbria University, co-editor of the Journal of War and Culture Studies. Formerly, she was a Wellcome ISSF Fellow at University of Leeds and visiting scholar at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing at Wolfson College, Oxford. She read for a PhD in English Literature at the University of Sheffield, where she was a Vice-Chancellor's Scholar. And I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming Tom and Shamragni to speak with us today.
Thanks, Eva, and I should start by saying that the project that Eva kindly talked about there is a bit of an ironic one to be talking about today, because it was conceived as being something to try and get away from conflict, in a sense, and that the queer history of Northern Ireland is best known in that period of the Troubles and the more recent past, which I don't think I need to say has been immensely difficult for LGBT people in the province. We all know about Ian Paisley's campaign to save Ulster from sodomy, failed, of course, and indeed of the recent lags in marriage equality. But this project was really conceived to think about, well, what about life before liberation, before the gay liberation movement of the 1970s and 1980s? And to think about how can we try and uncover lives that may have been lost, forgotten, or possibly purposefully ignored. Of course, conflict does exist within that prehistory as well, and that's something that we cannot get away from altogether, from the obvious conflicts around sectarianism, how that scene before liberation was still shaped by those factors, and also, of course, moments of wider conflict, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, mostly on the Second World War, and the sexual and social opportunities it gave to both male soldiers and civilians. But it's important to know that well before that conflict, it was actually pretty common knowledge that the all-male world of the military could be pretty queer. So in one big book about homosexuality, published in 1908, there is actually a whole chapter on military prostitution. Now, the author who first published this book under a pseudonym, perhaps for obvious reasons, explained to his readers that some young soldiers were what he described as constitutionally homosexual. Basically, that their natural sexual impulse was toward other men. But he also suggested that other soldiers were driven by more mercenary motives. The army simply did not pay enough, and they had to sell their bodies just to get by. Now, other men, usually older and wealthier, were always willing to pay. And it's only a brief reference in this book from 1908, but at one point the author does describe how both soldier-soldier and soldier-civilian relationships were ingrained in homosexual subcultures throughout North America and Europe, and including in cities in Ireland. And of course, there were barracks in and around Belfast throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and so occasionally servicemen do crop up in the historical record. Now, probably the most outrageous example can be found in 1894, when an English soldier chef found himself in trouble. Now, Freddie McGlinchey was working at the Victoria Barracks and lodging in North Belfast, but also journeying around the city centre. Late one night, he apparently stopped a policeman on High Street and asked him where the nearest public toilets were, and was pointed down one of the nearby entries, those covered alleyways that join together the main streets of the city. If we can believe what was said in court, this young man, Freddie McGlinchey, now began to fiddle with the policeman's trousers and demanded, "Show me the size of yours." Now, he got a slap on the ear for his trouble and then ran off. But less than an hour later, he was found in a different toilet, having sex with another soldier. Now, he was given 4 months in prison for this, but after he was released, he continued to work as an army chef across Britain and Ireland for decades following, and indeed got married and had children as well. Now, soldiers carried on getting themselves into trouble in Belfast for a long time after McGlinchey in 1894. And the most scandalous example is probably, though it's now forgotten, came when 2 English soldiers were dragged into court in 1952. Now, these 2 soldiers were stationed at Hollywood, just outside Belfast, but they came into the city for fun and entertainment. They described how one night a mysterious man had picked them up outside City Hall in a big car and driven them to a luxurious mansion in Lisbon, where they were treated to all the whiskey they wanted before staying the night. Now, the English newspapers reported that this was the house of Patrick Barber, a member of a wealthy and influential local family, but the newspapers in Northern Ireland suppressed that detail. And instead it was another man, a fashion designer from England, who took the fall and ended up in prison. Now, even more common than soldiers in the historical record are sailors, both Royal and Merchant Navy. They were lauded by homosexual men for their gruff manliness, sexy uniforms, and the exoticism of their adventures at sea. The travel writer Robert Harbinson, for example, who grew up in East Belfast, hinted at his lust for such men in a memoir of his early life. When he was just in his 20s and travelling to North America after the Second World War, he shared a cabin with Canadian seamen, aboard the passenger ship RMS Aquitania. Mama would have swooned in horror at the sight of 30 young men strutting naked between the cabin and shower baths, flicking towels at each other's buttocks. What would she have said about the huge hairy thighs swinging contentedly over the edge of bunks? Now, I know it's early in the morning for this sort of graphic description. I should have requested that I was put last at the end of the conference, really. Now, Hobinson was actually writing, surprisingly, for a respectable audience at a time when homosexuality was still taboo. So the queer desire of his work is implied rather than explicit. But still, I think his descriptions of muscular bodies that wrestled and writhed, panting and sweating, no holds barred on the cabin floor, left little to the imagination. But for those who moved in queer circles, or at least already knew the rumours of what Winston Churchill famously called rum, sodomy and the lash, Harbinson's musings on sailors would have been plainly obvious. And it's easy enough to see why sailors were such popular figures on urban queer scenes. But worth remembering that they were not always just paid partners or objects of desire for middle-class men. Often, they were the ones who were looking for casual sex too, whether they're now permanently resident on shore or just taking leave. And like their comrades who were paid for their bodies, they could justify their own queer desires for a variety of reasons. The simple availability of men compared to the relative absence of female partners when they were at sea, a belief that queer sex was less immoral than marital infidelity and also had the benefit of avoiding unwanted pregnancy, or even a fear that casual sex with women, and female prostitutes in particular, would lead to venereal disease. And when we look at the criminal record, we can find sailors all over the city throughout the first half of the 20th century. They're both paying for and selling sex around the docklands, they're drinking in the bars and then taking their lovers home, or they're hanging around those notorious entries that we've already heard about. But it's really the exceptional circumstances of conflict, and the world wars in particular, that movement of thousands of men between countries, the all-male world in which they lived, that made this sort of queer cruising culture even easier to find. Now, one of the best examples can be found in 1917 against the backdrop of the First World War. Vincent Cassidy, as you can see in the middle there, was the son of a Catholic saddler from Armagh and had already lived in Dublin, London and New York by his early 20s. When he was returning to Belfast in 1917, he passed through Liverpool, where he made a connection with one Jack Fearon, who was a soldier in the King's Liverpool Regiment. Now, there was another man, Francis Kavanagh, a young soldier from Cork, who had met Jack Fearon when they'd both been training together in Formby, which is a town near Liverpool. In early September, Kavanagh and Fearon ran into each other in Belfast, where both were taking leave, and the latter told the former about a party that was happening in the Imperial Hotel. Over several months, Vincent Cassidy now held parties where soldiers rubbed shoulders with civilians and drank whisky cocktails until the police finally got wind of the affairs and swiftly arrested the ringleader. Now, Vincent Cassidy had relationships with both servicemen and civilians, and men and indeed women. But there is evidence to suggest that many men were lusting after soldiers in particular. Henry Blair, for example, was an insurance manager in his late 40s, travelling between Liverpool and Belfast in early 1939, when he found himself in trouble on the MV Ulster Prince. Now, this man had booked a double berth under his own name with a Mr. Martin, but actually boarded this ship alone and never asked for a refund. So perhaps he wanted to head off any suggestions or suspicions that may have arisen if a steward saw two men entering a room with just one bed. Henry Blair actually spent most of the journey in the bar with a party of infantrymen from the 2nd Battalion of the South Wales Borderers, allegedly paying for all the drinks and allegedly also trying to pick these young soldiers up. One private, Douglas Taylor, told the courts how he took a chance and went down to Blair's cabin because he did not have anywhere else to sleep, but he then refused to get in the same bed and went back up to the party. Undeterred, Henry Blair went back to the bar and managed to persuade another Welsh private to join him instead, one William D. Williams, which must be the most Welsh name I've ever heard. Taylor must have told his comrades what he suspected was happening in the cabin, because a group of them tried to get in and rescue their comrade. After much shouting and banging, a partially dressed and likely quite sheepish Williams D. Williams finally opened the door. Now, when Henry Blair disembarked in Belfast a couple of hours later, he found that the police were waiting for him. They recorded how they had found an incriminating tub of Vaseline under his pillow. Now, the Second World War was the transformative moment when it came to the creation of a modern gay identity, something that didn't explicitly exist, at least in a widespread sense, before that period. And it was because the close homosocial world of the armed forces had erotic potential, and queer behaviour, from drag performances, as we can see here, to casual sex among soldiers, could actually be accepted as being good for army morale. Young men in huge numbers were now pulled away from the home or the small community and given an opportunity to test not just their patriotic duty, but their sexual prowess as well, though not without the risk of a court-martial and following disgraceful discharge. And there is some evidence to suggest that the war was an important moment of sexual realisation for some men in Belfast who signed up. One man arrested in Belfast in 1947 told the courts how he understood he was same-sex attracted as young as 11 years old. But it was only when he joined the Royal Marines during the war that he learnt a lot about what he called sex life. He described to the courts in 1944 how he went out east and discovered in India the books that explained his sexuality to him. Another man from Bangor, who was arrested in the 1960s, told the courts that he had fallen in with what he described as active homosexuals when he had joined up in 1945, and now was relatively honest about having the same sexual persuasion. Now, many of the men that we have records for in Belfast were prosecuted after one brief encounter, the unfortunate moment that they came into the purview of the police. But it was possible to have longer-term private relationships, and indeed in the services in particular. We know this because in the late 1950s, a sailor who was only in his late teens from North Belfast met the Scottish love of his life while they were both at sea. They were discharged from the Navy after they made it clear to their superiors that they did not want to be separated. And on those occasions where they were apart, they wrote beautiful love letters to each other. One of the most poignant ended, "I want you to know that I will never ever go back on anything I said. I promise that I will always be faithful to you, knowing that now I have conquered any difficulties that would have completely prevented me from being so. Never lose faith in me, for I am forever yours, faithfully. I love you. You are constantly in my thoughts and dreams." Now, when this young man was on shore leaving England and now lonely without his lover, he was consoled by naval comrades and civilians who were active on the queer scene too. Rosie, another sailor, showed this young man the gay bars of Portsmouth, a hotspot on the south coast, and introduced him to several of his camp friends who kindly promised to help with the naval situation that they'd found themselves both in. Now, if life at camp or on the front lines or at sea could be a revelation for young queer men, the Second World War also enlivened the scene back in Belfast. Northern Ireland, as many of you will know, was strategically important for the war effort because of its position in the Atlantic Ocean and its use as a launching point for American servicemen. Now, already by about 1941, there were over 100,000 British troops stationed in canvas camps, huts or requisitioned buildings. Between 1942 and 1944, over 300,000 Americans also passed through. At one point, there was 120,000 of them stationed here at one point. And given that the population of Northern Ireland is only roughly 1.2 million people at this point, these are obviously huge figures that are transforming everyday life. It's really this exotic and exciting presence of American GIs, oversexed, overpaid and over here, as the slogan went at the time, that was provoking fears about sexual immorality. But it's actually mostly wayward women who found themselves under the glare of negative publicity. The sexual opportunities that American troops brought to Belfast did delight the queer community as well, although none of these visitors from the States actually ended up in court themselves. And in fact, convictions of men who had sex with men remained relatively low throughout the 6 years of the war, and there was no discernible moral panic. Reports in the press of the rare cases that did make it to the courts were now even shorn of any details or reference to the same-sex element. if they were reported at all. And this is really a reversal of the trends of the 1920s and 1930s, when coverage was far less ambiguous. Men could be expected to be named for their crime and indeed have their address and occupation printed as well. So perhaps in religiously superior Ulster, it was bad for wartime morale to admit the existence of same-sex desire at all, given how many religious political divisions there already were and that were heightened by the conflict as well. But if the authorities continued to remain relatively tight-lipped about queer desire in the city, servicemen, whether on leave or passing through on journeys to other bases, were undoubtedly an important and very visible part of the urban sexual scene. And it was, by many accounts, a relatively exciting and liberating time. Neville Johnson, an English artist who had moved to Ireland in the 1930s, described how even in sturdily provincial Belfast, in nests of anarchy and deviation, orgies took place and mayhem prevailed. Now, whether any of these orgies that Johnson was referring to were made up solely of men is knowledge now lost to time, though this painter did have several queer friends. And one gay man did recall that the urinals were especially full the morning after the unexpected and devastating Luftwaffe raid in 1941. His historians, as Dagmar Herzog had suggested, it's perhaps possible that the horror of destruction may have led to a devil-may-care sexual attitude among men who perhaps usually managed to contain their desires. But it's certainly the case that in the Docklands, the bustling clubs and bars generally brought military men into contact with Belfast locals. Duÿ, that some of the older people in the audience of Belfast may actually remember, was the city's most notorious bar, shut down in the 1990s. I would have loved to have seen it. But it was near the Albert Clock in Queen's Square, and already a well-known cruising site in the early 20th century, being right in the path of passengers and sailors who were disembarking their ships. And Duÿ is still popularly remembered as being a legendary brothel that was particularly important, as we might expect, with sailors. But it's less commonly recognised that gay men were also attracted to its more tolerant atmosphere. During the war, one middle-aged man, who happened to be a puritanical teetotaler, was alarmed when he found out that his latest queer crush, a young merchant sailor, did not just have another lover in the Navy, but had also been in Duÿ's with his comrades. Perhaps while that young sailor was there, he met Gerard Dillon, an Irish artist who was born in the west of the city. Dillon visited this bar with other bohemian friends during the war and drew sketches of American servicemen for the cheap price of a drink. He apparently cruised Dublin's docks and had also spent many years in the more vibrant scenes of London, so probably he had been looking for connections in similar places in Belfast. And the darkness of the blackout could also provide a degree of cover for quick sexual encounters. In March 1941, two young men were found together in a public urinal on Queen's Quay in the Docklands. Neither had good reason to be there. One was a 19-year-old industrial worker from Newtonards, and the other was a lieutenant, or lieutenant I should say in English, corporal in the Royal Army Medical Corps and based at Malone Road. He told the police that he did not even realise that what they were doing was an offence. But both still ended up with time in prison. But the vast majority of servicemen did not get arrested, and they had both transactional and more extended social relations with civilians. We know this because of the remarkable survival of a gay diary of a Belfastman, which covers 1942 and describes the multiple opportunities that the city streets brought. In April 1942, this diarist picked up a young serviceman in Smithfield Market, known for its trade in second-hand books, some of which could be quite salacious. He took this soldier back to his house for tea, where they had a pleasant time chatting about poetry. He entertained other soldiers at his house as well, possibly including some Americans, and often gave them lifts in his car, though it's unclear how many of these friendships always had a romantic element. But the amount of cruising servicemen on the streets of the city was so high that this diarist now found that he had stiff competition for the younger men he preferred. On one occasion, he ran into a lad he had been chasing for some time outside what was the gay hotspot of the time, Woolworths. But his invite for an evening out was turned down because his target had already arranged to meet an Air Force officer, who was a much better proposition than a Belfast shopkeeper. And this young man then skipped off with another Air Force officer who just happened to be passing. So you get a sense of how busy this hotspot was. Later that same night, the Irish returned after meeting no one else around the city. Back on High Street, he ran into another man he knew, again outside Woolworths. And they chatted for a short time before another young man in the Air Force came along and took him out of sight. Now, early in the war, there had been concerns that hundreds of servicemen were aimlessly wandering the streets of Belfast with nothing to entertain them, especially on the Sabbath when the cinemas closed their doors. And the Reverend W.S. Kerr, preaching in St Anne's Cathedral and appealing to the fathers and mothers whose own sons may be tonight in strange cities, made it clear that the dangers were sexual. Our young soldiers and sailors are on Sundays exposed to peculiar moral temptations, Kerr told his audience. Many are lying in wait to lure them into evil. Agents are busy to attract them to dens of iniquity, where the loss of their money is not the worst disaster. Ooh. Now, whether this reverend realised it was not just the pimps and the prostitutes who had their eyes on servicemen is not clear. But the Women's Volunteer Patrol, which was set up in 1943, was concerned only with the behaviour of young women. Either way, for Belfast's queer men, the streets that were thronging with handsome young soldiers was more of an exciting prospect than a moral conundrum. Now, wartime Belfast, of course, was not as busy nor as radical as the paved double bed that was London during the Blitz, as Quentin Crisp famously described. But I think there were pockets of a more cosmopolitan and sexually adventurous culture, encouraged by that paradoxically socially relaxing influence of global conflict. But for those men who served, the war, we should say, was more than just a sexual opportunity. Henry Murray, for example, was a bobbin turner from Sailor Town in the docklands of the city, and just 17 years old when he got into trouble in 1926. Murray was discovered in the urinal in Docklands having sex with an American from New Orleans who was the same age. And he managed to persuade the police on that occasion that it was the sailors' idea to have sex, and so he escaped punishment himself. The American was swiftly stuck back on the boat and sent to America. But in 1938, Henry Murray, the bobbin turner from Sailortown, joined the merchant service, following in the footsteps of his father, who was a career soldier who had fought in the First World War himself. The son was awarded the British Empire Medal after showing great bravery after his ship was torpedoed. The newspapers described how he displayed outstanding courage and devotion to duty, how he remained in the engine room until there was no hope of saving the ship, and how he was among the last to leave. And intriguingly, the Belfast newsletter also noted in the report that he was 34 years old and unmarried. Maurice Neal, another Belfast lad, was a hairdresser during peacetime who worked at his father's shop on Rosemary Street in the city centre. He was interested in writing short stories and attending the theatre, but he also played rugby and other sports. And in those diaries that I mentioned before, we get a glimpse of his life and how he was friends with other queer men in Belfast in 1938 when he was about 21. On one occasion, the diary describes how these two men parted late one evening. I got his coat from the hall and he put it on in the morning room as the hall lamp was not lit. When we got to the front door in the porch, I took his hand in mine and was bidding him good night when my control completely gave way. Taking him in my arms, I kissed him on the cheek. "Do you mind?" I whispered. "No," he replied, and turned his face so that I kissed him on his lips. I left him to the tram corner and I went home to know the expression of what lying awake for happiness actually means. Now, this young man, Maurice Neal, had both girlfriends and boyfriends, which shows us that the binary categories of homosexuality and heterosexuality were not always as fixed as we might assume. But how this young man's life may have turned out in later decades, we will never know, because on the 9th of July 1943, the Northern Whig newspaper reported that Flight Sergeant Maurice Neal of the RAF had been killed in action. He had joined up in 1941 and finished his training in Canada. He was scheduled to have been home on leave just a week before and never made it. He was an only son and survived by both his mother and grandmother. Today his name is listed on the Air Force's memorial at Runnymede, overlooking the Thames, that commemorates the names of over 20,000 airmen who were lost in the war during operations from bases in the United Kingdom and Europe, and who indeed have no known graves. So I've said a lot in this talk about sexual encounters queer cruising, and arrests. But I want to finish by remembering that these soldiers and sailors were more than just their base sexual desires, or indeed their sexuality, if we want to use that term. They were also brave men, much loved by their families and friends, who signed up and fought for their country, even when that country had criminalised their victimless desires. And some of them, such as Maurice Neil, paid the ultimate price. Thank you.